Nope, I see Michael just joined us. Hello, Mike.
Afternoon, gentlemen.
How you doing, Mike?
Good, thanks.
I think we're ready to go, Brian. I'll let anyone else in that shows up.
Cool. Awesome. So let's go and get started. How's everyone doing today? Welcome back. It's Thursday. Today we're going to be talking about the Cirrus aircraft and making a go, no-go decision based off the weather and some of the problems that some of the pilots have encountered over time making that decision and how to circumvent those problems. So it's a little bit of ADM, a little bit of weather, and just a lot of personal experience. Aidan is going to be joining me in this presentation. He's a TCI with Palomar Aviation. As always, it's supposed to spark a discussion with you and your pilot friends. If you have any more questions, we do encourage you to contact us as CSIPs or TCIs or your local CSIP or flight instructor to get some more formal instruction on aeronautical decision making and how to make better decisions as a pilot. So something that we always hear all the time is, weather is the biggest hole I have in my aviation knowledge. And, going through all your training, instrument rating is very heavy on weather. Commercial pilot, you're still learning. And then as you get further on, you're just building on the knowledge you already had from private pilot instrument rating. It doesn't go much deeper into it. So when you are training, you're always told certain things. Stay away from ice. Stay away from the red on the radar. You need to check the weather before every flight. But no one really – you get into how to check the weather, what you're looking for. But sometimes you realize that you don't really understand what you're looking at. I'm sure Aidan, as a flight instructor and as someone who's been through his training recently, when you first start reading a METAR or a TAF, you're not really – you understand it, but you're still second-guessing if you really actually know what it's telling you and what's coming up on your route of flight. So something that has happened is people have put themselves in bad situations flying because they don't understand what they're looking at. And as a flight instructor, that's one of my biggest fears is that after a student gets their license, they're kind of in that 100-hour area. They're good pilot, but they're still new in the sense of being a pilot, and they fly in just a bad weather situation, and they could possibly kill themselves doing it. And especially in the Cirrus aircraft, over time, you've seen incidents like this, and that's why the CSIP program has dedicated all their resources to making a safer and more proficient pilot group who fly these aircraft. So I'm sure as you're training and as you learn more about your aircraft, your limitations, your personal limitations, and your weather, you want to make a trip, someplace farther away. You want to fly a couple states away. You want to fly into a different region of the country that you haven't flown before. And we want to talk about what are some considerations that you would take when you're making that trip. And Aidan, what was the furthest trip you took in an airplane before you got, your commercial pilot certificate?
Before I got my commercial pilot certificate, I think the longest flight was probably Palomar to Palm Springs, which was about a 3-hour round trip.
Right. But so, and those are two different climates. On some days, you have Palm Springs, which is really dry desert, Palomar, which is going to have different performance of the aircraft. And when you were doing those trips, especially on those days where you have some bad weather over San Diego, Palm Springs might not have bad weather. What were you looking at? What resources were you looking at as a private pilot to check the weather and see how your trip was going along your route of flight?
As far as checking the weather for the route of flight, ForeFlight is definitely the best tool to do that kind of thing. You can throw your flight plan into flights and grab a weather briefing that way. But really just looking at the METARs and TAFs along the route of flight, just because as a VFR pilot, there's going to be certain things that aren't really going to be as big of a factor to you. Say a cold front, you're going to look at like a TAF and see, well, there's forecasted of low ceilings and bad weather at my destination airport. So that really right there is a no-go decision. Whereas once you start working on the instrument rating stuff, you need to be able to figure out what type of weather is safe to fly in and then what type of weather is a no-go as well.
And how did your personal limitations change from before you got your instrument rating to afterwards? What type of weather would you feel more comfortable flying in? Because after I got my instrument rating, I wouldn't go down to minimums. I was comfortable, but I was still, I had just gotten it. I only had a couple hundred hours under my belt. The flying down to minimums in Florida generally is associated with a bad thunderstorm where I was training. So I wasn't going to do that. I had 800 feet. I needed to break out of the super 800 feet and have at least 500 feet before I hit minimums before I would go to that airport. So, how did you establish your personal minimums after you got your instrument rating? Because, everyone kind of has it different after they finish their training.
Is personal minimums for instrument, like you were saying, putting 100 or a couple 100-foot ceilings. Now, some airports in this area don't really have, like, for example, one of the airports near us, Gillespie, has an approach that takes you in, and the lowest minimums that you can get on that approach are 1,200 feet above the ground. So for me personally, I added, depending on when was the last time I had flown, if I had just flown with my instructor or if I was flying with my instructor, usually between 200 to 500 foot increase on the minimums as far as a cloud ceiling goes.
Right. And for me, I learned in a Cirrus aircraft with an Aviation system on how to do my instrument training. So flying that airplane, I felt a lot more comfortable flying in instruments than I did, a 6-pack, something else. And you think about it, a lot of approaches now are GPS approaches. So what happens if you did your instrument training in something that didn't have a WASH GPS and you've never done a WAS approach before, or an LPV approach, and you transition into a Cirrus aircraft, you're a new owner, you want to take a trip, the weather's bad, and the airport you're going to doesn't have an ILS, and I'll just shoot the RNAV. Well, what happens if you only have 2 RNAVs approaches ever under your belt and you haven't finished your embark training, you decided to go solo in this airplane? You can put yourself in a potentially bad situation if you don't understand the avionics. And that's why doing your training, doing the transitions with your local CSIPs at your training centers is so vital, because you need to make sure you understand these aircraft, because there more times than not, incidents and accidents occur in aviation because someone doesn't understand the system they're working or the instrumentation. And Aidan, I think you learned in a 6-pack for your instrument rating, or you did the G1000, right?
Yep. So I did all my training in an airplane with 6-pack with a GPS, and then my first job instructing was in airplanes that were 6-pack with no GPS. So I kind of got I've gone whole spectrum here: GPS, 6-pack, G1000, and I got to give it to Cirrus. It's good, really
right.
Good.
And I remember when I did your transition training for your TCI certificate, you picked up on the avionics really well, but sometimes students take a little bit more time with them, especially if they've never used something so intricate like the Perspective Plus system. So as an instructor, your biggest job is to make sure they're on top of their home study with the transition videos, all the avionics information available, and then making sure that they go through the flows that Cirrus have with the airplane. Because if you can memorize the flow and you understand the GPS system and all the avionics, if you get yourself into a potentially bad situation and you need to shoot a GPS approach, it's second nature on how to set it up, and you just do that by following the standard operating procedures. So before you go on any trip, obviously you need to make sure you're proficient in the airplane. You've done your weather planning, and something that is great about these airplanes is all the potential systems that you can add to them, such as the Fiki system. You can have the turbo to go over taller terrain in the flight levels, but you need to make sure you're proficient, and you need to make sure that you understand the systems that you're working and how they operate and the limitations to them. And Aidan, how do you talk to your students about transitioning from a 20 with no Fiki system to a 22 turbo, and what the ICE system does, but what the limitations are and where you would find that in the POH?
Well, I know 2 of my students are here right now. They're all working on their private pilot certificates and hoping to solo them real soon. So as of right now, they're not really too worried about icing systems and stuff as far as like a 22 turbo. But introducing them, say in the future, John and Mike, once you guys start flying the 22 turbo, one thing to note is just because the airplane does have a de-icing system doesn't really mean you should go out and fly into icing conditions, as that it really is a dangerous position to put yourself into, especially if maybe you haven't tested the de-ice system recently, or you're low on TKS fluid and are unfamiliar with just flying in weather in general.
Right. So these airplanes do have some really great systems that can help you get to your destination. But something that you need to stress to your students, and something if you're flying these aircraft, is that they can help you get there, but is it smart to take off in the first place? If you know through your entire route of flight there's going to be inclement weather, and you're thinking like you're going to be coming close on how much TKS fluid you have on board, or to get over some weather, you're going to have to go up into the flight levels for a long time, and you're going to have to wear that mask for 4 or 5 hours, depending on what your mission is. If you haven't done that before, and you haven't put a mask on for that long, you don't exactly know how your body's going to react to prolonged time up at that altitude. And you don't want that trip to be the first time you figure that out. You want to go up with a flight instructor and a CSIP and get the training and do a trip duel with somebody who's done it before to be safe. And because you never know, if you put the mask on wrong, hypoxia is insidious. It gets to you really quick and you have no idea. And the airplane has a lot of safety systems, especially the G6, if you don't, do anything on the airplane for a while. But if you never want to test yourself when you need to get someplace on a specific day. And it goes back to our talk on ADM Reimagined, where you need to make sure you're making these decisions in little increments, little 15-minute increments. Can I maintain VFR? Whatever your personal definition of a safe and proficient flight for you would be, you need to ask yourself, can I get there? But you also want to make sure that the first time you're trying to do something is not on a day that you need to get to someplace, because you never want to switch up what you're doing and where you're comfortable and where your personal minimums are on a trip that is vitally important. Because if you mess up or you get into bad weather and you miss a date, sometimes the best way to get to a place is just to take an airline. And Aidan, I'm sure you've run into some situations like this with some bad weather flying across the country recently, and flying a normally aspirated 22 that can't get over some weather systems. What was your thought process and what you were looking for along your route of flight?
Well, specifically the trip out to Dallas kind of rings a bell here. We were working with fairly good weather on the way out there, but then on the return trip, there was really the 2 days on either end of the day we ended up flying back. There was thunderstorms the day before and thunderstorms the day after, and smaller isolated thunderstorm cells during the day that we were planning to make our way back. So we made a good decision in the sense that we were checking the weather consistently before making that go or no go decision, to make sure that on our filed and expected route that we received, we were going to be far enough away, like we were talking about earlier, the 20 miles from thunderstorms, making sure that our route of flight actually abided by that, so that we could maintain the biggest safety as possible. Now, as we say, we're leaving, we went from Dallas to Amarillo, and then from Amarillo, we filed a flight plan out to Prescott. And on our way, probably about halfway there, at kind of a point where hold on one sec.
So I did a trip across the country recently where I was going to take off from Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport in a 22 turbo and fly it to Northern California. And my trip originally was supposed to be Saturday to Tuesday. And when I was doing my flight planning from Fort Lauderdale to my first fuel stop, I realized pretty quickly that there was a huge line of weather rolling through the southeast. And if I had done that trip, I was going to fly through a storm that ended up producing some pretty terrible tornadoes in the Mississippi area. So I still departed that day. But what I did is I decided that my home airport over near my parents' house, there was going to be good weather, and I decided to land there for the night. I overnighted in my own bed. I had the airplane with me. So I was already about 200 miles up the coast, and I just took off from there. And I made it one extra day, but it was for the interest of safety. And yes, could the airplane have gotten me through that bad weather? I probably could have found a hole, especially with the weather information on board, air traffic control, making sure you get good vectors around some storms. But what the smart thing was to do was get the airplane to a place that if I had it overnight for a couple of nights, I could, because at this time it was right at the start of the COVID quarantines in South Florida. The hotels weren't taking reservations. So I got the plane to a place where I could overnight. And then I took off from there a couple of days later and made it over to California. But along that trip, I'm very proficient in these Cirrus aircraft. I didn't go to, flight level 250 or anything like that because I had never done that by myself. I've only had the mask on for oxygen a handful of times, and it's always been with another more experienced instructor in that situation. So I didn't push myself. I had oxygen on. I went to 16,000 feet, but that's something I had done multiple times in my life. And this was a trip that, by all intents and purposes, it was by the book. I took off, I got fuel, and nothing went wrong. But I didn't want to push myself to a place where I wasn't comfortable during a time that I was on a way to a place where I had a time commitment. Because if I screwed up and, I needed to make an emergency landing because I wasn't feeling well or something like that, it could have screwed a lot of things up along that route of flight. And it's just being safe and understand what your personal limitations are. And, these Cirrus aircraft, they're amazing. They can get you anywhere quickly, safely, comfortably. But we have to stress this as flight instructors. Sometimes the airplane can get you there, but the pilot might not be able to get you there. And that's understanding personal limitations. And if you're a student that's coming up, we just had our first student pass his check ride at Palomar Aviation the other day in a 22 turbo, and he got his private pilot's license. And I was talking to him, and he was saying, I feel great. I'm a pilot. This is awesome. But I still want to do some of my cross-country dual because there's things I want to do that I haven't done before. And I know what my limitations are. And as a flight instructor and the CSIP who signed him off for his first solo, that makes me understand, okay, that student understands what it takes to fly an airplane and what it takes to be a good pilot and safe, because these airplanes are amazing. They have every system in the world you could possibly want for an airplane, but it's not going to save your life if you put that airplane in a bad situation. That airplane's going to do exactly what you tell it to do. If you tell it to do the wrong thing, if you tell it to do something that's not safe, there's no system that says, are you sure? It's going to tell you when problems start to happen. It's not going to help you make a good decision. That's where the pilot comes in. And, Aidan as a TSAP, Palomar Aviation, impresses me so much with how he's able to convey the importance of ADM in these airplanes to his students. And, when Aidan and I were doing his training, we had pretty good weather most of the time. But something that we didn't have was good traffic in the Southern California area, or good air traffic control. There was a couple of days where we were doing, a couple of instrument approaches, and air traffic control was just all over the place. And, that's something that both of us, when we were flying, remember that time when that air traffic controller, we were going to Gillespie doing the approach, and the SkyWest had the RA, and how jumbled in 10 seconds that whole process got, and kind of how we both worked together to get back on track. Even as two experienced instructors, it was 10 seconds before everything went to craziness. So what we did was we worked together as a team to look for some traffic. There was an air traffic controller and a SkyWest airplane that were arguing with each other, and we were on an instrument approach, but we had two targets on our TCAS coming right at us at different altitudes. Aidan was flying. I was sitting as just the instructor pilot for his TCI training. And in about 30 seconds, we went from a completely normal flight to just trying to make sure we weren't going to crash into anyone else. And then we ended up doing the approach and going to another airport, but it showed even with 2 experienced pilots on board, just the problem with the ATC that could lead to another problem. If you imagine you're doing something, an approach in bad weather, and you're going down to minimums, ATC is having a bad day, they're arguing with another airplane, they give you rushed vectors, they give you bad vectors, you're doing the approach, you're behind the airplane, or they just clear you for the approach and not ready for it. That can lead to a bad situation. You get behind the airplane, and then the second you get behind an airplane, you start messing more things up because you're trying to get back ahead of it. And Aidan, I'm sure you remember in your instrument rating, if you have any experience you want to share, you forget to do one procedure and then you need to do 10 more to catch up. And putting the GPS approach in, explaining like how you learn to be ahead of the airplane so you can be safer flying in bad weather.
Sorry, say it again, Brian.
So when you were doing your instrument rating, how did you help yourself get ahead of the airplane, and how you prevent yourself from getting behind? And what was something that you did to continually get better doing that?
During my instrument rating, my instructor definitely did a pretty good job of yelling at me when I didn't have things set up correctly, so that I could, I guess, be reminded of what needs to be done in a certain phase of flight. And then eventually, as I progressed through the instrument training, I was able to develop an understanding of, okay, what do I need to do next? What happens when I do this in the GPS? What happens when I do this with the avionics? And then transferring that over into then preparing myself as far in advance as possible. So, for example, like John and I, we went to Ramona the other day, and we tried to set up as many frequencies as possible out in the future so that we were as ready as possible for, say, getting into Ramona, doing our landing there, making sure we had the weather and so on.
Right. And when you're doing your training, you're doing your transition training, you're going into a new airplane, you're always going to feel at first that you're behind the airplane, but there's no other company that has the videos online that show you how to set everything up, the IFOM, that gives you all the procedures and the standard operating procedures on how to fly these airplanes. So the biggest thing you can do flying a Cirrus aircraft when you're transitioning, you're a new owner, you're getting your private pilot's license, and anything related, you want to really study these materials, and you want to continuously study these materials. You need to make sure that you have your icing awareness course done every 24 months, but you should really be doing it every 6 months, because if you haven't flown an icing every 6 months, you've run your FIKI system just to do it on the pre-flight so that it doesn't, it stays efficient, and you might not be really proficient flying an ice. And then one day you're out flying and flying the ice, and it might turn out okay, but it's always about learning. It's always about staying on top of what you know and continually get better with it. You always learn as you're flying, and flying in different weather and different climates. You can fly in Southern California to the desert, you can fly to the mountains, you can fly all over the place, and you're going to get into different weather patterns there. You need to know the airplane, you need to study the airplane, you need to study all the materials given to you, because that's how you're going to get better, but that's how you're going to stay safe. If you get into a problem and you're flying the airplane, you're on a long trip, and you have an enunciation and you don't know what the enunciation means, you could be flying, you can pull out the POH, but if you don't know in the POH where to look for it, now you're just stuck flipping page to page. Well, the problem could be getting worse, or you're wasting valuable time trying to find where you're going to divert to or figuring out your plan, because all you're trying to do is diagnose the problem. And that's mightily important as a private pilot, any type of pilot, is to make sure that you understand the airplane and understand the limitations of the airplane and understand your limitations flying that airplane. So, flying a Cirrus can get you from point A to point B to point C to point D and back comfortably, safely, efficiently. You're going to have a lot of fun doing it. You're going to look really cool doing it. But you want to make sure that you understand what the limitations of the entire trip are, and you're making the right decisions on how to get there. And the best way to do it is, if you have questions, talk to your local CSIP or TCI. Go to your local training center and get a couple flights under your belt if you haven't flown instruments in a while. stay current. If you haven't done your instrument currency in 6 months, don't go up with an instructor instead of a safety pilot, and just get some instruction while you're doing it. You're going to be in the airplane anyway. It's safer, and then you can get your IPC done if you're close on it anyway. Don't wait for a flight review just to get more instruction. Every 6 months, every 90 days, make sure that you're going up with somebody as an instructor at TCI, CSIP, and getting some formal training to be safer, because you might have been taught one way by somebody who wasn't a CSIP or a TCI, but the Cirrus way, which is the right way to fly these airplanes, is going to come to you from a Cirrus training center and a CSIP and a TCI. And that's the important thing when you're flying these airplanes. If you follow the guidelines and the standard operating procedures that Cirrus lays out for you and all the resources available, you're going to fly these airplanes safely and efficiently and proficiently. So that's important. So Aidan, anything that you want to add about, the capabilities of the Cirrus, but also some of the limitations that you want to make sure you stress to your students over time, especially when you start teaching the students we have with us instruments and so on?
Earlier we were talking about flying near thunderstorms and utilizing the weather radar. One thing to note about that is that it's just a uplink from our ADSB rather than an actual weather radar in the airplane. So it is slightly delayed data rather than having an actual weather radar in the airplane that could give you real time. So you need to treat that as helpful information, but not the be all end all of I'm going to make this left turn to avoid this cell of precipitation.
Right. And that brings up a good point with, and this will be the last point, with the onboard weather systems. And as Aidan stated, it's not real time. So you do see where the delays are, how old the information is. But the best thing to do is to ask air traffic control. If you're flying in a situation where you're flying near thunderstorms and you're trying to skirt at VFR, you've already made a horrible decision. So if you're talking to air traffic control, you're flying instruments, or you're on flight following, because you can maintain VFR with some diversions here and there and deviations, you can ask them. They'll have the most accurate and up-to-date information. They'll give you suggested headings, and never be afraid to ask, especially if you're on an instrument flight plan, can I deviate 10 left for a couple miles and go around this cell? Just because there's a giant cell on your route of flight on the Victor Airway does not mean you cannot go around it. And that's something that you'll hear all the time, especially as you start flying on center frequencies a lot. You're going to hear Southwest, American, Delta. How's the ride? How's the ride? How's the ride? Can I go 10 left? Can I go 5 right? Can I do this? Can I do that? And the air traffic control will say yes all the time. And it's to make the ride comfortable for the passengers, but pilots don't want to go through bad weather either, because it's a bump. It's unnecessary, especially if you can just go around it. So when it comes to flying these aircraft, they're incredibly capable, and they are very, very, very safe airplanes. They have all the features available that you would want to fly across the country, to fly across Europe. Wherever you want to take these airplanes, they can get you there. But is it smart to go sometimes? Absolutely not. Is it something that you never want to get to your destination and be like, okay, thank God I'm here because that was bad. You never want to fist pump after landing an instrument approach because you were so nervous about getting in. These are calculated decisions that you're doing. These are procedures that you are following. This is something you are trained to do. You should never be on a what if, or I hope this goes well mindset when you're flying an airplane, because it's a hazardous attitude, which you'll hear all the time when it comes to aeronautical decision making. So I just wanted to thank Aidan for joining me for this conversation. I think he had a lot of good insights from an instructor point of view and kind of how his training went. And I just wanted to thank everyone else for joining us. We are going to be dropping these Zoom calls to one time a week. They're going to be every Tuesday from now on. Thankfully, we're busy flying our airplane again, so we just want to make sure that we can get our students in the air. I'll still be hosting them every Tuesday. We'll be continuing to update the schedule, and as things start back open up over the summer, we'll adjust the schedule accordingly. But I just want to thank everyone for their time, especially the people who've been here every Zoom call. We really appreciate it. And Chuck Callie, who is one of the best CFIs, double I's. I don't know if you have an MEI, but he has this amazing idea on aeronautical decision making, and he's taught us a lot about it at Palomar Aviation. So I just want to give him a couple minutes of our time to kind of talk about, his experience over however many years flight instructing.
Well, Brian, thank you. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
First, I want to start off by saying that was a great talk between Brian and Aidan. Some good conversation, some good lessons in aeronautical decision making. There was just a couple of key points that after 40 years of doing this, I wanted to point out. One of them is Brian mentioned that he, am I talking too loud? That he didn't feel good about continuing I forgot the reason. And I wanted to say that there's two exceptionally good aeronautical decision-making tools that go in the airplane with you every time you fly. One of them is your gut, and the other one is the window in front of you. If either one of those two are giving you pause, pay attention to it, okay? It doesn't matter how capable the airplane is. And I think you'll find that you have more fun actually trying to stay out of the weather than just bulldozing your way through the weather. But that's my personal opinion after 40 years of doing this. I like flying around the weather, quite frankly. The other thing was the onboard weather information, which I believe in your airplane is ADS-B, is the source of that. Other airplanes also have XM. Either way, there is latency there. I think most of you've heard about it, but it's only real. I mean, I've tested XM against onboard radar in our SF-50 Vision Jet, and it's amazing how well those two agree. And so my message today is that not that they agree, but that the one time they're not going to agree is the one time you need it. Okay, and so use onboard radar strategically and not tactically. I guess those are the words that are most commonly used, and I'm just going to relate one quick story on a trip from Boston to Jamaica. We were flying into northern Florida over Gainesville, and we had been watching a system that was spinning off the east coast of Florida all day on the XM. And as we proceeded south, we just kept watching it. We just kept deviating more and more west. And by the time we got into Florida and passed west of Gainesville, we were able to aim straight down toward, I don't know, Tampa, I think. I'm not real much of a Florida guy, but Tampa, somewhere around there. And then we just descended down from 10,000 feet or wherever we were to about 2,000 feet, turned left, went east, and flew straight into Fort Lauderdale. And we didn't get a drop of rain on the airplane. So we were able to make great long-term decisions. And I like to say that we were able to see into the future with XM. And that's what you use XM for, looking into the future. And with that, I'll take my gray hair and say thanks for listening.
And Chuck did make a good point. Your gut is something that over time becomes pretty reliable. So I am a Florida guy, and the thunderstorms that we fly, I flew a 22 as a corporate pilot for a long time. And I had to get lawyers from one place to another, and court doesn't really care what's going on. They just want the lawyer in front of them. So there would be times where I would have to divert pretty far across the state of Florida. And then it turned into, do I have enough gas to do this? Florida's a long state. So I can go from where my home base was to the Panhandle. It's a 3-hour flight. I divert 60 miles to the east. Now I have an extra 60 miles to go straight across the Panhandle going west. So the wind's probably going to my nose. Oh, I'm going to be under IFR reserve. Well, then, okay, well, I'll just cancel VFR. And then you realize, like, well, that's just really dumb. If you're doing that to get to your destination, you've lost the whole game.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't have gone and just told the lawyers, let's live to argue another day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, great job, guys.
Yeah, the XM helps you out a lot with that. I thankfully never had to do that, but that was just a scenario that I've posed to them over some time. But Chuck, thanks for your input. Aidan, thanks for your input, and thanks to everyone for joining us. These will be posted on our website, palomaraviation.com, to review later on. And we just wanted to thank everyone for their time. We'll see you on Tuesday.